Welcome to this quiet space. Wherever you are right now, whatever the day has asked of you, you can let it go. You've arrived here, and that's enough. There's nothing more you need to do, nowhere else you need to be. Tonight, we're traveling together to the mountains, not the loud, ambitious peaks that call for conquest, but the older ones. The quiet ranges where mist gathers in the valleys and stone paths remember 10,000 footsteps. These are the mountains where monks have walked for centuries, where tea is brewed slowly, where stillness is not emptiness but fullness. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow. Notice your breath, how it comes and goes without any effort from you. You don't have to control it. You don't have to fix anything. The stories you're about to hear are simple ones. They unfold slowly, the way mist moves across a valley. There are no battles here, no urgency, no need to remember what happens. These tales exist only to accompany you as you drift towards sleep. If you hear every word, that's fine. If you fall asleep halfway through the first story, that's even better. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the world outside this moment fade. Let your thoughts become like clouds passing over a mountain present, but not demanding. Let yourself be held by the softness of this space. And now, the first story begins. There was a monk who lived on the eastern slope of a mountain so remote that even the wind seemed to arrive late, as if it had forgotten the way and needed to ask directions from the pines. His name was Kozan, though he rarely heard it spoken aloud anymore. Most days passed without the sound of a human voice, and he had grown fond of this silence the way others grow fond of music. The monastery he belonged to was 7 days' walk down the mountain, a place of gray stone and raked gravel where 100 monks rose before dawn to chant sutras and polish wooden floors. Kozan had lived there for 20 years, moving through the same rooms, the same routines, until one autumn the abbot had called him into the garden and asked if he would go up the mountain to tend a small hermitage that had been empty for a decade. "It's very quiet there," the abbot had said, which was not a warning but an offering. Kozan had left the next morning. That had been 3 years ago. Now, as the first light of dawn touched the tips of the highest pines, Kozan stood at the entrance of his small wooden hut and looked out over the valley below. The air was cool and thin, carrying the scent of cedar and the faint mineral smell of mountain stone. Mist moved through the trees like something alive, pooling in the low places, rising and dissolving as the sun climbed. He stepped outside onto the wooden platform that served as a porch. His feet were bare, and the wood was cold and slightly damp from the night. He could feel every grain of it, every small ridge and imperfection. This was one of the things he had learned in his time here, that paying attention to small sensations was a form of prayer, though he would never have said so aloud. It would have sounded too precious, too deliberate. Better to simply feel the cold wood and say nothing. The morning was utterly still. No birds yet. The wind had not arrived. Even the pines stood motionless, as if they too were waiting for the day to decide what it would become. Kozan walked to the edge of the platform and knelt down, placing his palms flat on the wood. This was his habit each morning, a small ritual that marked the boundary between sleep and waking. He would kneel like this for a few breaths, feeling the surface beneath him, acknowledging that he had been given another day. The wood was rough in some places, smooth in others. He could feel a small knot beneath his left palm, a raised circle where a branch had once been. He pressed gently into it, tracing its shape without looking. The knot was hard and uneven, a tiny landscape of rises and falls. He stayed like this for a long time, longer than usual. There was no reason to hurry. The sun would rise whether he watched it or not. The day would unfold in its own time. After a while, he stood and walked down the 3 wooden steps that led from the platform to the earth. The ground was soft with pine needles, years and years of them layered into a thick mat that gave slightly under his weight. He walked a few paces into the clearing and stopped. The hermitage sat at the edge of a wide meadow that sloped gently upward toward a ridge of stone. Beyond the ridge, the mountain continued, peak after peak, fading into blue distance. Below, the valley was still filled with mist, a white sea from which the tops of trees emerged like islands. Kosen stood and watched as the light changed. It moved across the landscape slowly, touching first the highest points, then creeping down into the shadows. The mist began to thin, pulled apart by warmth, revealing the darker green of the forest below. He noticed a single stone at his feet, half buried in the pine needles. It was gray and smooth, about the size of his palm. He knelt and picked it up, brushing away the bits of needle and dirt that clung to it. The stone was cool and heavy, and its surface had been worn smooth by water. Though the nearest stream was a 10-minute walk away, he wondered how it had arrived here. Perhaps a monk before him had carried it, or perhaps it had always been here, slowly sinking into the earth. He held it in both hands and felt its weight. It was nothing special, just a stone, but it had been shaped by time, by water and weather, into this particular form. It had been here long before him and would remain long after. Kosen set the stone down carefully, exactly where he had found it, and straightened. The sun had risen higher now. The valley below was beginning to reveal itself, patches of forest and the silver thread of a distant river. He turned and walked back toward the hut. There was water to fetch, tea to prepare, the small tasks of the day waiting for him, but he moved slowly, as if each step were its own arrival, its own small ceremony. Inside the hut, the light was dim and golden. A single window on the eastern wall let in a narrow beam of sunlight that fell across the wooden floor, illuminating a rectangle of polished grain. Kosen stood just inside the doorway and watched the light for a moment, the way it caught tiny particles of dust suspended in the air, each one drifting slowly, illuminated and then disappearing back into shadow. The hut was simple. A sleeping mat rolled in the corner, a low table, a few shelves holding bowls, a teapot, a small statue of the Buddha carved from dark wood. Everything had its place, and everything was exactly as it needed to be. On the table sat a clay cup. It was the only cup he owned, and he used it every day for his tea. The cup was old, made by a potter whose name he had never known, and it had a small crack running down one side. The crack did not go all the way through, so the cup still held water, but it was visible, a thin, dark line that divided the surface. Kosen walked to the table and picked up the cup, turning it slowly in his hands. The clay was rough and unglazed, a pale gray color that darkened where his fingers touched it. He ran his thumb along the crack, feeling the tiny ridge where the clay had split and then settled into this new shape. He had noticed the crack the first morning he arrived at the hermitage. He had found the cup sitting on this same table, left behind by whoever had lived here before. At first, he had thought he should replace it, that a cracked cup was somehow insufficient. But then he had made tea and drunk from it, and the tea had tasted the same as it always did, and he realized that the crack did not diminish the cup. If anything, it made the cup more itself. It was proof that the cup had been used, that it had held heat and cold, that it had survived. Now, 3 years later, he could not imagine using any other cup. This one fit his hand perfectly. He knew the exact weight of it, the way it warmed when filled with tea, the way the rough clay felt against his lips. He set the cup down and went to the corner where a large ceramic jar held water he had carried up from the spring the day before. He dipped a ladle into the jar and poured water into a small iron kettle, then carried the kettle to the fire pit in the center of the room. The fire pit was lined with stones, and in the center, a few pieces of charcoal waited beneath a layer of ash. Kosin knelt beside it and carefully brushed the ash aside, revealing the charcoal beneath. He arranged a few twigs and dry grass over the charcoal, then struck a flint until a spark caught. The grass smoked, then flared. The twigs crackled. The fire grew. He set the kettle on the iron grate above the fire and sat back on his heels, watching as the flames settled into a steady burn. The fire made small sounds, tiny pops and whispers. The kettle began to tick as the iron expanded with heat. Kosin sat very still, his hands resting on his knees. His attention was entirely on the kettle, on the fire, on the way the light moved across the walls of the hut. He was not thinking about anything else. He was not planning the rest of the day or remembering the past. He was simply here, watching water begin to warm. After a long while, the kettle began to hum, a low sound that grew gradually louder. Steam rose from the spout, a thin white column that dissolved into the air. Kosin waited until the hum became a gentle whistle, then lifted the kettle from the fire using a thick cloth. He carried it to the table and poured the hot water into the clay cup, where a small amount of loose tea leaves waited at the bottom. The water turned pale green almost immediately, and the scent of the tea rose into the air, grassy and clean. Kosin set the kettle down and wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the heat soak into his palms. He did not drink yet. He simply held the cup and let the warmth move through him. Outside, the wind had finally arrived. He could hear it moving through the pines, a soft rushing sound that rose and fell like breath. The light from the window had shifted slightly, the rectangle of sun now touching the edge of the table. Kosin lifted the cup to his lips and took a small sip. The tea was hot and bitter and exactly right. He closed his eyes and let the taste fill his mouth, then swallowed. The warmth moved down his throat and into his chest. He took another sip, and then another, each one slow and deliberate. There was nothing else he needed to do. There was only this cup, this moment, this small act of drinking tea. When the cup was empty, he set it down gently on the table and sat for a moment longer, his hands resting in his lap. The fire had burned down to embers. The light from the window had moved further across the floor. Everything was exactly as it should be. There was a path that led from the hermitage up through the forest to a ridge where the trees thinned and the mountain revealed itself. Kosin walked this path every afternoon, not because he needed to, but because walking was its own form of meditation, and the body needed to move. Today, after his tea, after sweeping the small porch and folding his sleeping mat, he set out along the path. He wore simple robes, gray and worn soft from years of washing, and his feet were bare as always. The ground was familiar to him now, every root and stone, every place where the path narrowed or turned. The forest was thick with pines and a few scattered oaks whose leaves had turned yellow and orange with the season. The air was cool and smelled of resin and earth. Sunlight fell in bright shafts through the canopy, illuminating curtains of slow-moving insects and the occasional spider web stretched between branches, each thread catching the light like something woven from glass. Kosin walked slowly, placing each foot with care. This was not caution, exactly, but awareness. He had learned that walking could be done quickly, or it could be done with attention, and the latter was always more satisfying. He felt the texture of the path beneath his soles, the smooth places and the rough, the coolness of stone and the softness of moss. A squirrel chittered somewhere above him, and he paused to look up. The animal was perched on a branch, its tail flicking, watching him with bright black eyes. Kosin smiled slightly and continued walking. The squirrel followed him for a while, leaping from branch to branch, then lost interest and disappeared back into the canopy. The path climbed steadily, winding between boulders and stands of fern. In places, the ground was carpeted with fallen pine needles, and his footsteps made almost no sound. In other places, dry leaves crackled and rustled. He liked both kinds of walking, the silent and the loud. Each had its own quality. After a time, the trees began to thin, and the path emerged onto a ridge of bare stone. Here, the wind was stronger, moving steadily up the slope from the valley below. Kosin stopped at the edge of the ridge and looked out. The view was immense. The valley spread out beneath him, a patchwork of forest and meadow, with the silver line of a river cutting through the center. Beyond the valley, more mountains rose, layer after layer, each one paler than the last until they faded into the distant sky. The air was so clear he could see individual trees on the far slopes, dark green shapes standing against the lighter green of grass. He stood and let the wind move around him. It tugged at his robes and cooled his face. He could feel it against his bare arms, steady and strong. He did not resist it or lean into it. He simply stood and let it be what it was. There was a large flat stone near the edge of the ridge, worn smooth by wind and weather. Kosin walked to it and sat down, crossing his legs beneath him. The stone was cool through the fabric of his robes. He rested his hands on his knees and closed his eyes. At first, there were thoughts. Small ones, passing quickly. The memory of the tea he had drunk that morning, a line from a sutra he had once memorized, the image of the squirrel in the tree. He did not try to push the thoughts away. He simply noticed them, watched them arise and dissolve like waves on the surface of water. Gradually, the thoughts became less frequent. The spaces between them grew longer. His breath slowed, each inhalation and exhalation deep and even. He was aware of the wind, the coolness of the stone, the distant sound of the forest below, but he was not thinking about these things. He was simply present with them. Time passed. He did not know how long he sat there. It might have been minutes or hours. The sun moved across the sky and the shadows shifted, but he did not open his eyes to check. At some point, a bird called, a high, clear note that echoed across the valley. Kosin listened to it fade, then opened his eyes. The light had changed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the ridge. The air had grown cooler. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from sitting. He stretched slightly, feeling the pull in his legs and back, then turned and began walking back down the path toward the hermitage. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. But the path was familiar, and his feet knew the way. He walked steadily, his mind quiet, his body moving with the same careful attention he had brought to the climb. By the time he reached the hermitage, the sun had dropped behind the western peaks, and the valley below was filled with blue twilight. A few stars were beginning to appear in the sky, faint and far. Kosin climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch and stood for a moment, looking out over the meadow. The air was very still. The wind had stopped. Even the pines were silent. He felt a deep sense of peace, not because anything had changed, but because everything was exactly as it was. The day had unfolded in its own time, and he had moved through it without resistance, without grasping for anything more than what was offered. He turned and went inside. Inside the hut, Kosin lit a single oil lamp. The flame flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting a warm yellow light across the room. He set the lamp on the low table and knelt beside it, his hands resting in his lap. The evening had a different quality than the morning. The silence was deeper, more complete. Outside, the world was settling into night. Inside, everything was still. Kosin sat and simply breathed. He did not try to think or not think. He did not try to feel anything in particular. He simply sat, aware of the rise and fall of his chest, the small movements of air in and out of his body. This was the heart of his practice. This simple act of sitting, it was not dramatic or profound in any obvious way. It was just sitting, but in the sitting, there was a kind of freedom, a spaciousness that opened when he stopped trying to be anywhere other than where he was. After a long while, he rose and went to the corner where his sleeping mat lay rolled. He unrolled it carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles, then arranged a thin blanket over it. He extinguished the lamp, and the room fell into darkness. He lay down on the mat and pulled the blanket over himself. Through the window, he could see a few stars, bright points against the black sky. He watched them for a time, his breathing slow and even. His body felt heavy, sinking into the mat. His mind was quiet. There were no thoughts demanding attention, no worries pulling him toward the future or the past. There was only this moment, this breath, this soft descent into sleep. The sound of the wind returned, very faint, moving through the pines outside. It was a lullaby, older than any song. Kosin listened to it, his eyes half closed, and felt himself beginning to drift. He did not fight it. He let himself sink deeper, the boundaries between waking and sleeping growing softer, less distinct. His breath slowed even further, each exhalation longer than the last. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a low hoot that echoed across the valley. Kosin heard it, registered it, and then let it go. His eyes closed fully. His body settled completely, and in the darkness of the hermitage, high on the eastern slope of the mountain, he slept, not because he had solved anything or achieved anything, but simply because the day had ended and sleep was what came next. The night deepened, the stars turned slowly overhead, and the mountain held him, as it held all things, with infinite patience and infinite stillness. And somewhere not far from here, beneath the same stars, another quiet tale waits to be told. In a village that clung to the side of a mountain, there lived a woman named Ayame who made her living dyeing cloth. Her workshop was a small wooden structure at the edge of the village, near the stream that provided the water she needed for her work. The building was old, its beams dark with age and weather, and the roof tiles were covered in moss that had been growing there longer than anyone could remember. Ayame was not young. Her hair had long ago turned gray, and her hands were stained permanently with traces of indigo and madder root, colors that had seeped into the creases of her palms and beneath her fingernails. She had been dyeing cloth for 40 years, learning the craft from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, and so on back through generations. The work was simple but exacting. It required patience and attention, a willingness to move slowly and observe carefully. Ayame had both of these qualities in abundance. She never hurried. She never forced anything. She allowed the colors to reveal themselves in their own time. Today, as the first light of morning touched the stream outside her workshop, Ayame stood at the threshold and looked out over the water. The stream was narrow but swift, flowing down from the higher slopes, carrying the cold clarity of mountain snowmelt. Its voice was constant, a soft rushing that filled the air day and night, so familiar that Ayame no longer heard it unless she chose to listen. She stepped outside, her wooden sandals clicking against the smooth stones that lined the path. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of moss and wet earth. Mist rose from the stream in thin wisps, drifting between the trees that lined the banks. Ayame walked slowly down to the water's edge and knelt on a flat stone that had been worn smooth by years of kneeling. She leaned forward and dipped her hands into the stream. The water was shockingly cold, so cold it made her fingers ache, but she kept her hands submerged, letting the cold move up through her wrists and into her arms. This was how she began every morning, a small ritual of attention. She would hold her hands in the stream and feel the water moving over them, the current pressing against her palms, the temperature numbing her skin. She would stay like this until her hands were completely cold, and then she would lift them out and let them warm slowly in the air. Today, as she knelt with her hands in the water, she noticed a small stone caught in the current near her fingers. It was gray and round, about the size of a plum, and the water moved around it in tiny eddies and swirls. She watched the patterns the water made, how it divided and came together again, how it created shapes that lasted only a moment before dissolving. The stone itself was unremarkable, just a stone, but the way the water moved around it was beautiful, endlessly complex and changing. Ayame watched for a long time, her hands growing numb, her attention absorbed completely by the small miracle of water flowing over stone. Eventually, she lifted her hands from the stream and stood. Her fingers were white with cold, the skin puckered and stiff. She held them in front of her and watched as the color slowly returned, pink spreading from her palms to her fingertips. She flexed her hands, feeling the blood moving back into them, the warmth returning. She turned and walked back to the workshop, her sandals clicking on the stones. Inside, the room was dim and cool, smelling of wet wool and the earthy scent of plant dyes. Long wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and from them hung bundles of dried plants, indigo leaves, madder root, weld woad. Along one wall, clay jars held powders and liquids, each labeled in Ayame's careful script. In the center of the room sat a large iron pot, blackened with use, resting on a stone hearth. Beside it, folded neatly, was a length of undyed linen waiting. Ayame walked to the hearth and knelt beside it. She reached for a bundle of kindling stacked nearby and began to arrange the pieces in the bottom of the hearth, building a small structure of crossed sticks. Her movements were practiced and precise, the result of doing this same task 10,000 times. When the kindling was ready, she struck a flint and caught a spark in a handful of dry grass. The grass smoked, then flared into flame. She placed it carefully beneath the kindling, and the fire caught, crackling softly as it grew. She watched the fire for a moment, making sure it would sustain itself, then reached for a bucket of water she had filled the night before. She poured the water into the iron pot, filling it halfway. The water was clear and cold, and it made a soft sloshing sound as it settled. Next, she went to the shelf where the jars of dye were kept and selected one labeled indigo. She opened the jar and looked inside at the dark blue powder. Indigo was her favorite dye, the one she worked with most often. It was temperamental, requiring careful attention to temperature and timing. But when it worked, the color it produced was like nothing else in nature, a deep, luminous blue that seemed to hold light within it. She measured out a small amount of the powder into a wooden bowl, then added a bit of lye water and stirred it with a stick until the powder dissolved into a thick paste. The paste was dark, almost black, and it smelled sharp and alkaline. She carried the bowl to the hearth and poured the paste into the pot of water, stirring gently with a long wooden paddle. The water turned murky, a greenish-brown color that gave no hint of the blue it would become. Ayame set the paddle aside and sat back on her heels. The fire crackled beneath the pot. The water would need to heat slowly, gradually, until it reached the right temperature. This could not be rushed. If the water was too hot, the dye would be ruined. If it was too cool, the color would not set. She sat and watched the pot, her hands resting in her lap. This was the part of the work that required the most patience. There was nothing to do but wait and observe. She watched the surface of the water, looking for the first tiny bubbles that would indicate the temperature was rising. She listened to the fire, adjusting the wood when needed to keep the heat steady. Time passed. The light from the doorway shifted as the sun rose higher. A bird called from somewhere outside, a series of clear notes that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Ayame's attention did not waver. She was entirely present with the pot, the fire, the slow transformation happening in front of her. She noticed everything: the way the light played across the surface of the water, the faint shimmer that appeared as the temperature rose, the subtle shift in color from brown to a darker, richer hue. After a long while, the first bubbles appeared, tiny and fleeting, rising from the bottom of the pot and disappearing before they reached the surface. Ayame leaned forward slightly, watching carefully. The water was almost ready. She reached for the length of linen and unfolded it, running her hands over the fabric to smooth out any wrinkles. The linen was soft and finely woven, the work of a weaver in the next village. It had taken the weaver weeks to make, and now it would take Ayame hours to dye it properly. She held the linen in her hands and felt the weight of it, the texture. It was clean and pure, waiting to be transformed. She folded it carefully, accordion style, so that it would fit into the pot, then set it aside. The water in the pot had begun to steam, thin wisps rising into the air. Ayame stirred it once more with the paddle, then judged it ready. She lifted the folded linen and lowered it carefully into the pot, submerging it completely. The fabric floated for a moment, then began to sink as it absorbed the liquid. Ayame set a lid on the pot, leaving a small gap for steam to escape, and sat back. Now there was nothing to do but wait again. The linen would need to steep in the dye for at least an hour, absorbing the color slowly, the molecules of indigo bonding with the fibers of the cloth. She stood and walked to the doorway, stepping outside into the morning air. The sun was higher now, warming the stones of the path. The mist had lifted from the stream, and the water sparkled in the light. Ayame stood and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the clean mountain air. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because the work was finished. It was far from finished, but because she was doing it. Because she was here, in this moment, attending to this task with all the care it required. She stood for a long time, listening to the stream, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. And then, when she was ready, she turned and went back inside to tend the fire and wait for the color to take hold. Inside the workshop, the air had grown warmer. The fire beneath the pot had settled into a steady burn, and the steam rising from the lid carried the sharp, earthy smell of indigo. Ayame sat beside the hearth, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She was not thinking about anything in particular. Her mind was quiet, her attention resting gently on the pot and the cloth steeping inside it. This kind of waiting was not passive. It required a special quality of presence and openness to the moment without anticipation or impatience. She had learned this over many years. In her youth, she had been restless, always eager to see the results, to lift the cloth from the dye and see if the color had taken. But her mother had taught her to wait, to trust the process, to understand that rushing only led to mistakes. "The cloth knows what it's doing," her mother used to say. "You just have to let it." Ayame smiled slightly at the memory. Her mother had been gone for 15 years now, but her voice was still clear in Ayame's mind, as clear as if she were sitting right here beside the hearth. She glanced at the pot. It was not yet time to check the cloth. She would know when it was ready, not by a clock or a timer, but by a feeling, an intuition built from decades of experience. The right moment would arrive, and she would recognize it. Until then, she sat. A fly buzzed into the workshop through the open door, circling lazily in the dim light. It landed on the edge of the pot, walked a few steps along the iron rim, then flew off again. Ayame watched it go, her expression calm and mild. Outside, the sound of the stream continued, a constant low murmur. A breeze stirred the hanging bundles of dried plants, making them sway slightly. The shadows on the floor shifted as the sun moved. Ayame closed her eyes and simply breathed, in and out, slow and steady. She felt the rise and fall of her chest, the air moving through her nostrils, the slight coolness of the inhalation, the warmth of the exhalation. This was meditation, though she would not have called it that. It was simply sitting, simply being present. She had no formal practice, no teacher, no tradition. She had only this: the work, the waiting, the quiet attention to each moment as it arose. After a long while, she opened her eyes and looked at the pot. Something had shifted. She could feel it, though she could not have said exactly what had changed. It was time. She stood and removed the lid from the pot. Steam billowed up, warm and fragrant. She picked up the wooden paddle and gently lifted the edge of the cloth, raising it just enough to see the color. The linen had turned a deep greenish blue, darker where the folds had been and lighter on the exposed surfaces. This was normal. Indigo always looked green at first, when it was still wet and infused with the dye. The true blue would appear when the cloth was exposed to air, when the oxygen transformed the color. Ayame used the paddle to carefully lift the cloth out of the pot. It was heavy with liquid, dripping thick greenish drops back into the pot. She carried it to a wooden frame near the door and draped it over the horizontal bars, spreading it out so that it hung in long, even folds. And then she stepped back and watched. This was the part she loved most, the quiet magic that never ceased to amaze her. As the cloth hung in the air, exposed to oxygen, the color began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the green shifted. A hint of blue appeared, then deepened. The cloth darkened, the color spreading through the fibers, transforming before her eyes. Ayame stood very still, watching the metamorphosis. It was like watching a flower bloom, or the sky change at twilight, a natural process that unfolded according to its own rhythm, beyond her control, beyond her intervention. The green faded, the blue grew richer, more intense. Within minutes, the cloth had transformed completely, becoming a luminous, deep blue that seemed to glow in the dim light of the workshop. Ayame let out a slow breath. It had worked. The color was perfect. She reached out and touched the cloth gently, feeling the damp coolness of it against her fingertips. The fabric was soft and slightly rough, the texture of good linen, and the blue had penetrated deeply, staining every fiber. She would need to rinse it now to wash away the excess dye, and then hang it to dry, but that could wait. For now, she simply wanted to stand here and look at it, to appreciate the beauty of this color that had emerged from earth and water and time. She thought about the woman who had woven this cloth, the hours of work that had gone into creating each thread, each careful pass of the shuttle through the loom. And she thought about the person who would eventually wear this cloth, whoever they might be, carrying this blue with them through their days. There was a continuity in this, a chain of care and attention that stretched from the past into the future. Ayame was just one link in that chain, doing her small part, offering her skill and her patience to the work. She stood for a long time, looking at the blue cloth hanging in the doorway, the light from outside illuminating it from behind, making it almost translucent. And she felt, as she often did at moments like this, a quiet gratitude, not for anything in particular, just gratitude for being here, for having work to do, for the simple privilege of attending to the world with care. The afternoon sun was warm on the stones outside the workshop. Ayame had rinsed the dyed cloth in the stream, the cold water running blue at first and then clear as the excess dye washed away. Now the cloth hung on a line stretched between two trees, fluttering gently in the breeze, the blue vivid against the green of the forest. Ayame sat on a low wooden stool near the stream, her hands resting in her lap. She had finished the work for the day. There was nothing more that needed doing. The cloth would dry in its own time. Tomorrow she would fold it and deliver it to the woman who had commissioned it. But for now, there was only this, the sound of the stream, the warmth of the sun, the sight of the blue cloth moving in the wind. She felt tired, but it was a good tiredness, the kind that comes from work well done. Her hands ached slightly from the cold water, and her back was stiff from bending over the pot. But these were small discomforts, easily borne. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun, feeling the warmth soak into her skin. Behind her eyelids, the world was red and gold, the color of sunlight filtered through living tissue. She breathed slowly, deeply, letting her body rest. A thought arose. She was getting old. Her body no longer moved as easily as it once had. Her hands were not as steady. One day she would no longer be able to do this work. One day, someone else would stand in this workshop, tending the fire, dyeing the cloth. The thought did not sadden her. It was simply true, the way all things are true in their time. She had been given many years to do this work, and she had done it as well as she could. That was enough. She opened her eyes and looked at the blue cloth hanging in the breeze. It was beautiful. It would last for years, perhaps decades, before it finally wore out and returned to the earth. And even then, something of it would remain, the memory of its color, the care that had gone into its making. Ayame stood slowly, her knees creaking slightly, and walked back to the workshop. Inside, she banked the fire, covering the coals with ash so they would burn slowly through the night. She tidied the space, putting away the jars and the paddle, sweeping the floor. When everything was in order, She closed the door and walked up the path toward her small house at the edge of the village. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cooling, and the first stars were appearing overhead. At her house, Ayame lit a small oil lamp and prepared a simple meal of rice and vegetables. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, then cleaned her bowl and set it aside. She unrolled her sleeping mat and lay down, pulling a thin blanket over herself. Through the window, she could see the last light fading from the sky. The village was quiet, settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Ayame closed her eyes and let her body sink into the mat. Her breath slowed, each exhalation longer and deeper than the last. She felt herself drifting, the boundaries between waking and sleeping growing soft and permeable. She thought of the blue cloth hanging on the line, moving gently in the night breeze. She thought of the stream flowing past her workshop, cold and clear and constant. She thought of all the cloth she had dyed over the years, all the colors she had coaxed from plants and minerals and time, and then she thought of nothing at all. Her mind emptied, becoming as still and clear as the water in the stream. Her breath became almost imperceptible, a whisper of air moving in and out. And in that stillness, in that quiet darkness, she slept deeply and completely, without dreams, without disturbance. The night held her, the way it holds all things, with infinite gentleness and care. And beneath that same night sky, in a place where mountains meet the edge of silence, one more story unfolds. There was a man named Daigo who lived alone in a stone hut at the base of a waterfall. The waterfall was not large or famous. It did not attract pilgrims or poets. It simply existed, a narrow ribbon of white water falling 30 feet from a granite ledge into a small pool surrounded by moss-covered rocks. Daigo had come to this place 7 years ago, after his wife died. He had been a merchant in the city, a man of business and noise and constant movement. But when his wife passed, something in him had broken open, and he found he could no longer bear the life he had been living. He had sold everything, given away what he could not sell, and walked into the mountains with nothing but a wooden staff and a small bag of rice. He had walked for weeks, sleeping in temples and caves, eating what he could forage or what villagers offered him. And then one day he had come upon this waterfall, and he had known immediately that this was where he would stop. He had built the hut himself, gathering stones from the hillside and fitting them together without mortar. The roof was made of pine branches layered thick enough to shed rain. There was no door, just an opening covered by a piece of cloth. Inside, the space was barely large enough for him to lie down, but it was enough. Now, on a cool autumn morning, Daigo sat on a flat rock beside the pool at the base of the waterfall. The sound of the water was constant and overwhelming, a roar that filled his ears and made thinking almost impossible. This was why he had chosen this place. The noise drowned out everything else, his thoughts, his memories, his grief. It left only the present moment, loud and undeniable. He had been sitting here for an hour, his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, streaked with gray. His robes were old and patched, faded from brown to a pale tan. He owned nothing except these robes, a wooden bowl, and a small knife. The water fell endlessly, white and churning, breaking against the rocks and sending up a fine mist that hung in the air like fog. The mist was cold against Daigo's face, dampening his beard and his robes. He did not wipe it away. He simply sat, and felt it, the tiny droplets settling on his skin, cool and clean. He watched the water with unwavering attention. He had been watching it every day for 7 years, and he had never grown tired of it. The water was always the same and always different. The pattern of its falling never repeated exactly. Each moment was unique, irreplaceable. He noticed a single leaf caught in the current near the edge of the pool. It was yellow, shaped like a spearhead, probably from one of the oaks that grew further up the hillside. The leaf spun in a small eddy, turning slowly, pulled down and then released over and over. Daigo watched the leaf for a long time. It seemed to be struggling, though of course it was not. It had no will, no intention. It simply moved according to the forces acting upon it, the current, the weight of the water, the shape of the rocks beneath the surface. Eventually, the leaf was pulled under and did not resurface. Daigo continued to watch the spot where it had disappeared, waiting, but it did not come back. He thought about impermanence, how everything arises and passes away. The leaf, the water, his own life. All of it temporary, all of it part of the same vast flowing. When his wife had died, he had been devastated. He had raged against the unfairness of it, against the cruelty of a world that could take someone so vital, so necessary. He had wanted to understand why, to find some meaning in the loss. But sitting here beside the waterfall, day after day, year after year, he had come to see that there was no why. Things simply happened. Life arose and then it ceased. The waterfall fell because water obeyed gravity. His wife had died because bodies fail. There was no deeper explanation, no hidden purpose. This understanding had not made the grief go away. The grief was still there, a dull ache that never entirely left him, but it had changed the grief somehow, made it more bearable. He no longer fought against it. He let it be what it was, another current in the great flow. Daigo stood slowly, his knees protesting after the long stillness. He stretched, feeling the pull in his legs and back, then walked to the edge of the pool. He knelt and cupped his hands in the water, bringing it to his mouth. The water was shockingly cold, so cold it hurt his teeth, but it tasted clean and pure, like melted snow. He drank several handfuls, then splashed water on his face, washing away the mist in the night's sleep. The cold shocked him fully awake, and he gasped slightly, shaking his head. He stood and walked back to his hut. Inside, he found his wooden bowl and filled it with the last of his rice from a small cloth sack. He would need to walk down to the nearest village tomorrow to trade work for more food. But today, he had enough. He built a small fire outside the hut, using dry twigs and a bit of moss for tinder. When the fire was burning steadily, he set the bowl of rice on a flat stone near the flames, adding a bit of water from the pool. He stirred the rice with a stick, watching as it slowly softened and cooked. The morning was bright and clear. Birds called from the trees, and the sunlight fell in bright patches through the canopy. The sound of the waterfall was softer here, a background hum rather than a roar. When the rice was ready, Daigo removed the bowl from the fire and sat down to eat. He ate slowly, one small bite at a time, chewing thoroughly. The rice was plain and unseasoned, but it was warm and filling, and he was grateful for it. After he finished eating, he cleaned the bowl in the pool, scrubbing it with sand until it was clean, then set it aside to dry. He extinguished the fire, scattering the coals and covering them with dirt. Then he walked back to the flat rock beside the waterfall and sat down again. This was his life now, simple and quiet and utterly without drama. He sat by the waterfall. He ate when he was hungry. He slept when he was tired. He walked in the forest, gathered firewood, mended his robes, and slowly, over the years, something in him had settled. He was no longer the man he had been in the city. That person had dissolved, worn away by water and time, leaving someone quieter, simpler, less burdened. He sat and watched the water fall, and he felt, for the first time in many years, something like contentment, not happiness, exactly, but a deep acceptance of things as they are. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shifted, and Daigo sat, as still as the rocks around him, letting the sound of the waterfall wash through him like a prayer. The afternoon grew warm, and Daigo felt drowsiness begin to settle over him like a blanket. He had not slept well the night before his back had ached, and he had spent hours lying awake, listening to the waterfall and watching the stars through the gap in his roof. Now, sitting on the sun-warmed rock, he felt his eyelids growing heavy. He did not fight it. He had learned that the body knows what it needs, and when it needs rest, it is best to listen. He stood and walked slowly back to his hut. Inside, the air was cool and dim, smelling of stone and earth. He lay down on his sleeping mat, which was thin and worn but adequate. He pulled his robe around himself and closed his eyes. Through the opening of the hut, he could still hear the waterfall, that constant voice that never stopped, never rested. At first, when he had come here, the sound had kept him awake, its relentlessness oppressive. But over time, it had become a comfort, a presence as constant as his own heartbeat. He listened to it now, letting the sound fill his awareness. He did not try to block it out or quiet it. He simply let it be, a vast rushing that surrounded him on all sides. His breath slowed, his body relaxed into the mat. He felt himself sinking, as if the ground beneath him were soft and welcoming, as if he were being held by something larger than himself. Images arose in his mind, his wife's face, the city streets where he used to walk, the merchants he had known. But these images were faint now, like old paintings whose colors had faded. They no longer pulled at him with the same force. They were just memories, passing through like clouds. He thought about the leaf he had seen earlier, spinning in the eddy, how it had finally been pulled under and disappeared. He wondered where it had gone, whether it had been carried downstream or wedged between rocks, and then he realized it did not matter. The leaf had completed its journey. It had done what leaves do, grown, fallen, returned to the water. He too would complete his journey one day. His body would fail, just as his wife's had, just as all bodies do. He would fall like the leaf and be carried away, and that would be the end of this particular form. The thought did not frighten him. It was simply true, and there was a strange peace in accepting it, in seeing his own life as part of the same great pattern, no more or less significant than the falling water or the spinning leaf. His breathing became almost imperceptible. His awareness grew soft and diffuse, spreading out beyond the boundaries of his body. He was the hut, the stone, the waterfall. He was the sound and the silence beneath the sound. And then, without noticing the transition, he was asleep, deeply, completely, without dreams. His face was peaceful, the lines of tension and grief smoothed away. His chest rose and fell with slow, even breaths. Outside, the waterfall continued its endless falling. The sun moved across the sky, a breeze stirred the trees, and Daigo slept, held by the mountain, cradled by the sound of water, at rest in the great stillness that underlies all movement. The afternoon passed into evening. The light grew softer, more golden. And still he slept, his body taking what it needed, replenishing itself in the deep quiet of dreamless rest. And in another fold of these mountains, where mist gathers and old paths wind between standing stones, another story waits. There was a young woman named Hannah who lived in a village perched on a mountain ridge. The village was small, no more than 30 houses clustered around a central well, and it was so remote that travelers rarely passed through. The people who lived there had been there for generations, farming the terraced fields that clung to the hillsides, tending the same plots of land their ancestors had worked for centuries. Hannah's family grew barley and buckwheat. It was hard work, and the yields were never generous, but it was enough to live on. Her father and brothers managed the fields, while Hannah and her mother tended the house and prepared the meals. But Hannah had another occupation, one that was hers alone. She was the village's keeper of bees. The bees lived in wooden hives arranged in a small clearing at the edge of the village, where wildflowers grew in abundance and the sun reached the ground for most of the day. There were 6 hives, each one carefully tended, each one home to thousands of bees that went about their work with quiet purpose. Hannah had learned beekeeping from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before her. It was knowledge passed down through the women of her family, whispered lessons about how to read the bees' moods, how to harvest honey without disturbing the hive, how to help a weak colony survive the winter. Today, as the morning sun climbed above the eastern peaks, Hannah walked along the path that led to the clearing. She carried a wooden bucket and wore a wide-brimmed hat with a veil of fine mesh that hung down to protect her face. Her movements were slow and deliberate. When working with bees, haste was dangerous. The bees could sense anxiety, could smell fear. It was essential to approach them calmly, with respect. The path wound through a stand of pine trees, and the air was cool and fragrant with resin. Hannah could hear the bees before she saw them, a low humming that rose and fell like a distant song. It was a sound she had known her entire life, as familiar as her own breathing. She emerged from the trees into the clearing, and there they were, the 6 hives arranged in a neat row, their wooden surfaces weathered to a soft gray. And all around them, the air was alive with bees, hundreds of them, moving in lazy arcs from hive to flower and back again. Hannah stood at the edge of the clearing and simply watched for a while. This was important to observe before acting, to understand the mood of the hives. She could tell much from watching, whether the bees were calm or agitated, whether they were bringing in pollen, whether there were any signs of weakness or disease. Today, the bees seemed content. They moved with purpose but without urgency, their flight paths smooth and direct. Several workers were clustered on the landing board of the nearest hive, their bodies dusted yellow with pollen. Others were arriving, their legs thick with the golden powder they had gathered from the wildflowers. Hannah walked slowly into the clearing, approaching the hives from the side so as not to block the flight path. The humming grew louder as she drew near, a deep vibration that she could feel in her chest. She loved this sound, found it deeply soothing. It was the sound of work being done, of life being lived in its fullest expression. She set down her bucket and stood beside the first hive. She placed her hand gently on the wooden surface and felt the warmth radiating from within. The hive was alive, a single organism made of thousands of individuals, all working together with perfect coordination. Hannah closed her eyes and simply stood there, her hand on the hive, listening to the bees. She could feel the vibration through the wood, a subtle tremor that pulsed and shifted. It was like feeling a heartbeat, the rhythm of the colony's life. She stood like this for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just being present with the bees. This was something her grandmother had taught her, that the best way to work with bees was to first become still yourself, to match your energy to theirs. After a while, she opened her eyes and slowly removed the top cover of the hive. Beneath it was an inner cover with a small hole in the center. She lifted this as well, moving carefully, and looked down into the hive. The interior was a marvel of organization. Wooden frames hung in neat rows, each one covered with wax comb built by the bees themselves. On the comb, bees clustered thick as a living blanket, moving slowly over the surface, tending the cells where eggs were laid and honey was stored. Hannah reached in and gently lifted one of the frames, holding it up to the light. The comb was beautiful, a geometric masterpiece of hexagonal cells, each one perfectly formed. Some of the cells were capped with wax. These held honey, sealed away for the winter. Others were open, revealing the golden liquid inside, still being worked by the bees. She examined the frame carefully, looking for signs of the queen. The queen was the heart of the hive, the mother of every bee, and her presence was essential. Without her, the colony would fail. And there she spotted her. The queen was larger than the other bees, her body longer and more graceful. She moved slowly across the comb, pausing occasionally to inspect a cell, surrounded by attendants who groomed her and fed her. Hannah felt a small surge of relief. The queen was present and healthy. All was well. She carefully replaced the frame and closed the hive, moving with the same slow deliberation she had used to open it. A few bees had landed on her veil, crawling across the mesh, but she did not brush them away. They were just investigating, checking who this visitor was. After a moment, they flew off to return to their work. Hannah moved to the next hive and repeated the process, opening it, inspecting the frames, checking for the queen. Each hive had its own personality, its own subtle differences. Some were calm and gentle, barely noticing her presence. Others were more defensive, sending out scouts to buzz around her head in warning. But Hannah was not afraid. She understood that the bees were simply protecting their home, and she respected that. She worked slowly, methodically, moving from hive to hive. The sun climbed higher, warming the clearing. Sweat began to bead on her forehead beneath the veil, but she did not hurry. This work could not be rushed. By the time she reached the final hive, the morning was half gone. She opened it and looked inside, and immediately she knew something was wrong. The bees were agitated, moving in quick, erratic patterns. There was a high-pitched buzzing that was different from the usual hum, more urgent, almost distressed. Hannah's heart sank. She lifted a frame and examined it carefully. Several of the cells were discolored, the larvae inside dark and misshapen. She recognized the signs immediately: foul brood, a disease that could destroy a hive if left unchecked. She closed the hive and stood back, thinking, this was a serious problem, but not an insurmountable one. She would need to remove the diseased frames and burn them, then treat the hive with an herbal remedy her grandmother had taught her. It would take time and care, but the colony could be saved. She picked up her bucket and walked back toward the village, her mind already planning the work ahead. But despite the problem, she felt a sense of calm. This was the nature of beekeeping: constant vigilance, constant care. The bees gave so much honey, wax, the pollination of crops, but they required attention in return. It was a partnership, a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. As she walked through the pine trees, She could still hear the humming behind her, that low song that never stopped. And she felt grateful, as she always did, for the privilege of working with these small, perfect creatures, for being trusted with their care. Back in her family's house, Hannah prepared the remedy she would need. She gathered dried herbs from the rafters, thyme, sage, chamomile, and ground them into a fine powder using a stone mortar and pestle. Her mother watched from across the room, kneading dough for the evening's bread. "How are the bees?" her mother asked. "One hive has foul brood," Hannah replied, not looking up from her work. "But I caught it early. I'll treat it this afternoon." Her mother nodded. She understood the rhythms of beekeeping, the way a problem could arise suddenly and require immediate attention. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she said quietly. Hannah paused in her grinding and looked up. Her grandmother had died 3 years ago, and Hannah still missed her deeply. The old woman had been small and bent, her hands twisted with age, but her mind had been sharp until the very end. She had taught Hannah everything, not just about bees, but about patience, about observation, about the importance of moving through the world with care. "I hope so," Hannah said softly. She finished preparing the remedy, mixing the powder with warm water to create a thin paste. She poured it into a small clay jar and sealed it with a cork. Then she gathered a few other tools, a knife, a basket for the diseased frames, and headed back to the clearing. The afternoon sun was warm, and the clearing was drowsy with heat. The bees continued their work, oblivious to Hannah's concerns. She approached the diseased hive slowly, speaking softly to the bees as she came near. It was a habit her grandmother had taught her to talk to the bees, to let them know you were there, to reassure them. "It's all right," she murmured. "I'm here to help. We'll fix this together." She opened the hive and began removing the frames one by one, examining each carefully. When she found a diseased frame, she set it aside in the basket. The bees crawled over her hands, but none of them stung. They seemed to understand that she meant no harm. By the time she finished, she had removed 4 frames. It was a significant loss, but the hive would recover. She closed the hive and carried the basket of diseased frames to a clear area away from the hives. There, she built a small fire and burned the frames, watching as the wax melted and the wood blackened and crumbled. The smoke rose into the air, carrying with it the sweet smell of burning wax. Hannah watched until the fire burned down to ashes, making sure every trace of the disease was destroyed. Then she returned to the hive and opened it again. She took the jar of herbal remedy and carefully drizzled it over the remaining frames, making sure it reached into every corner. The bees crawled through the liquid, spreading it with their bodies as they moved. The herbs would help strengthen the colony, help them fight off any remaining infection. When she finished, she closed the hive and sat down on the grass nearby. She was tired, her back aching from bending over the hives, her arms heavy, but she felt satisfied. She had done what needed to be done. She lay back on the grass and looked up at the sky. A few white clouds drifted overhead, moving slowly in the high air. The sound of the bees surrounded her, that constant humming that never ceased. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, feeling it vibrate through her body. She thought about her grandmother, about all the times they had sat together in this clearing, working side by side, her grandmother's weathered hands moving with practiced ease over the frames, her voice soft as she explained the secrets of the hive. "The bees are teachers," her grandmother used to say. "They show us how to live with purpose, with cooperation, without waste. If you watch them closely, they'll teach you everything you need to know." Hannah had watched, and she had learned. She had learned patience from the way the bees built their comb, cell by cell, never rushing. She had learned cooperation from the way they worked together, each bee doing its part without question or complaint. She had learned acceptance from the way they adapted to whatever the world gave them, plenty or scarcity, warmth or cold. And she had learned that care was not a burden but a privilege, that tending something with attention and love was one of the deepest satisfactions life could offer. She lay in the grass for a long time, listening to the bees, feeling the sun warm her skin, and gradually, without intending to, she began to drift. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxed completely into the earth. The humming of the bees became a lullaby, ancient and soothing. She thought about nothing. Her mind was empty, peaceful, held in the moment like a bee held in amber. And then, gently, softly, she slipped into sleep. Right there in the clearing, surrounded by the hives, cradled by the sound of the bees and the warmth of the afternoon sun. She slept deeply, her face peaceful, a small smile on her lips, and the bees continued their work around her, moving in their perfect patterns, building, tending, living out the ancient rhythms of their kind. The afternoon deepened. Shadows began to stretch across the clearing, and Hannah slept on, at peace, at rest, held by the mountain and the earth and the endless song of the bees. And there, where the mountains bow to meet the rivers, and the light falls soft as memory, one more story waits to be told. In a small riverside town, there was an old man named Ren who spent his days repairing shoes. His shop was barely a shop at all, just a wooden stall tucked between two larger buildings, with a slanted roof that leaked when it rained and a single bench where he sat and worked. But for 40 years, people had been bringing him their worn shoes, and for 40 years, he had repaired them, stitching leather, replacing soles, making old things serviceable again. Ren was small and slight, his body bent from decades of hunching over his work. His hair was white and thin, his face creased with deep lines. His hands were gnarled, the knuckles swollen with age, but they were still steady, still capable of threading a needle and pulling it through tough leather. He worked slowly now, much slower than he had in his youth. But he had never been in a hurry, even then. He believed that shoes deserved the same care and attention that one would give to any important thing. After all, shoes carried people through their lives. They walked with them through joy and sorrow, through ordinary days and extraordinary ones. They deserved to be treated with respect. This morning, as the pale light of dawn spread across the river, Ren sat on his bench and looked at the pair of sandals that had been left with him the day before. They were simple sandals, the kind worn by laborers and farmers, made of woven straw with leather straps. The straps had broken, and the sole of the left sandal had worn through in the center, leaving a hole the size of a coin. Ren picked up the sandal and turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. The straw was old and brittle in places, but the weaving was good, tight, and even. Someone had made these sandals with care, and they had been worn with equal care, broken in slowly until they fit their owner's feet perfectly. He set the sandal down and reached for his tools. He kept them in a small wooden box beside the bench needles of various sizes, spools of thread, pieces of leather, a curved knife, an awl. Everything was old and well used, the handles of the tools smoothed by decades of handling. He selected a piece of leather from his scrap pile, a section cut from an old boot that was beyond repair. The leather was thick and strong, darker in some places than others, marked by years of wear. He laid it over the hole in the sandal's sole and traced around the hole with a piece of chalk, giving himself a slight margin. Then he picked up his knife and began to cut. The blade was sharp, honed on a whetstone every morning, and it sliced through the leather with a soft whisper. Ren cut slowly, following the chalk line exactly, his hand moving with the precision that comes only from endless repetition. When he finished cutting, he held up the leather patch and examined it. It was not perfect, one edge was slightly uneven, but it would do. He set it aside and picked up the sandal again. Using the awl, he punched holes around the edges of the damaged area, spacing them evenly, working with patient care. Each hole had to be in exactly the right place, or the stitching would pull unevenly and the patch would not hold. He worked methodically, one hole at a time, the awl biting through the tough straw and leather. His breathing was slow and steady. His attention was completely absorbed in the task. There was nothing else in the world except this sandal, these holes, this careful work. When all the holes were punched, he threaded a needle with heavy wax thread and began to stitch the patch in place. The needle moved in and out, each stitch pulled tight but not too tight. Too much tension would tear the old straw, too little would leave the patch loose. Ren stitched slowly, checking each stitch before moving to the next. His fingers moved with a kind of automatic grace, the result of performing this same motion thousands upon thousands of times. He did not have to think about what he was doing. His hands knew. The morning sun rose higher, warming the air. The river flowed past, its surface catching the light and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. People began to move through the streets, vendors setting up their stalls, children running to school, workers heading to the fields or the docks. Ren barely noticed. He was entirely focused on the sandal, on the thread moving through the leather, on the slow accumulation of stitches that would make this thing whole again. After a long while, he tied off the final stitch and cut the thread. He held the sandal up and examined his work. The patch was secure, the stitching even. It would not be invisible, there was no way to hide the repair, but it would hold. The sandal would be wearable again. He set the sandal down and picked up the broken strap. This would be easier. He cut a new strap from another piece of leather, shaped it to match the old one, and threaded it through the holes where the original strap had been attached. He tied it securely, then tested it, pulling hard to make sure it would not come loose. Satisfied, he set the repaired sandal beside its mate and leaned back on his bench. His hands ached slightly from the work, and his eyes were tired from the close focus, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. The sandals were whole again. They would serve their owner for many more miles. He thought about the person who owned these sandals, whoever they were. He had never met them. The sandals had been left by a child who said his father needed them repaired. But he felt a kind of connection to this unknown person, a sense of kinship that came from having worked on something they used every day. He wondered about their life, about the paths they walked, the work they did. Were they kind? Were they happy? He would never know. But in some small way, by repairing these sandals, he had helped them. He had made it possible for them to continue walking, to continue doing whatever it was they needed to do. This thought pleased him. It was not a grand thing, repairing shoes. It would never make him wealthy or famous. But it was useful, it was needed, and there was a dignity in that, a purpose. Ren stood slowly, his knees protesting, and stretched. The sun was higher now, nearly midday. He had been working for hours without realizing it. Time moved strangely when he was focused on his work. Hours could pass like minutes. He looked down at the sandals on the bench, then carefully wrapped them in a piece of cloth and set them aside. The owner's child would come by later to collect them. He sat back down and looked out at the river. It flowed endlessly, the way it had flowed for all the years of his life, the way it would flow long after he was gone. The sight of it was soothing, the constant movement, the way the light danced on the surface. He thought about his own life, about all the shoes he had repaired over the decades, thousands and thousands of them, each one different, each one carrying its own story. And now he was old, nearing the end. His hands would not be able to do this work much longer. One day soon, someone else would sit on this bench, threading needles, stitching leather. The thought did not sadden him. It was simply the way of things. Everything passed, everything changed. The river taught that lesson every day. He sat and watched the water flow, his mind quiet, his body at rest, and he felt grateful for the life he had lived, for the simple work that had given it meaning. The afternoon grew warm, and Ren found himself growing drowsy. The sound of the river, the warmth of the sun, the tiredness in his hands, all of it conspired to make his eyelids heavy. There was a small room behind his stall, barely more than a closet, where he kept a rolled mat for napping. He stood and made his way there, moving slowly, his joints stiff. Inside, the room was dim and cool. He unrolled the mat and lay down on it, his body settling into the familiar contours. Through the small window, he could see a patch of blue sky and the top of a willow tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. He closed his eyes and let his body relax. The sounds of the town filtered in voices, footsteps, the creak of cartwheels, but they were distant, muted, as if coming from very far away. He thought about the sandals he had repaired that morning, about the careful work of his hands. He thought about all the shoes he had fixed over the years, the endless parade of worn leather and broken straps, each one a small problem solved, a small service rendered. And he thought about his own father, who had been a shoemaker too, and his grandfather before him, 3 generations sitting on benches, working with their hands, tending to the shoes of strangers. There was a continuity in that, a thread that stretched back through time. He was part of something larger than himself, a long line of careful workers, each one doing their small part, each one passing the craft to the next generation. He had no children of his own. The line would end with him, but that was all right. He had done his part. He had kept the tradition alive for as long as he could. His breathing slowed, becoming deep and even. His mind grew quiet, thoughts dissolving like mist in sunlight. He felt himself sinking, falling gently through layers of wakefulness into something deeper. He did not resist. He let go, allowing himself to be carried. The sound of the river seemed to grow louder, filling his awareness. It was the sound of time itself, flowing endlessly, carrying all things toward the sea. And Ren drifted on that current, his body at rest, his mind at peace. He dreamed of nothing, or perhaps of everything. The two were not so different. He dreamed of shoes and rivers and the patient work of hands. He dreamed of stitches holding things together, of broken things made whole. And in his dream, he was young again, sitting on his bench in the morning light, threading a needle, beginning another repair. His hands were strong and steady. The work stretched out before him, infinite and satisfying. He slept deeply, peacefully, in the small room behind his stall, and outside, the river continued to flow. The sun continued its arc across the sky, and the world continued its gentle turning. The afternoon deepened into evening. The light grew softer, more golden, and Ren slept on, held by the rhythm of his own breathing, cradled by the years of work well done, at rest in the great stillness that waits beneath all effort. And now, in this last quiet space, where stories end and sleep begins, one final tale. There was a temple far up in the mountains, so remote that most people did not even know it existed. It was not large or grand, just a small wooden structure with a tiled roof, surrounded by a stone wall that had crumbled in places and been rebuilt by the monks who lived there. Only 3 monks lived at this temple now. Once, long ago, there had been many more, but over the years their numbers had dwindled. The temple was too isolated, too difficult to reach. Young monks preferred the larger monasteries in the valleys, where there were teachers and libraries and communities. But these 3 had chosen to stay. They liked the silence, the solitude, the way the days unfolded without interruption or demand. The eldest of the 3 was a monk named Jiro. He was in his 70s now, his back bent, his face a landscape of wrinkles. He had lived at this temple for 50 years, arriving as a young man and never leaving. He had watched other monks come and go, had seen the temple fall into disrepair and then be restored, had witnessed seasons turn into decades. Jiro's days were simple and unchanging. He woke before dawn, performed his morning chants, swept the courtyard, tended the small vegetable garden behind the temple. In the afternoons, he sat in meditation. In the evenings, he read sutras by candlelight, the ancient texts worn soft from handling. Tonight, as the last light faded from the sky, Jiro sat on the wooden porch of the temple and looked out over the valley below. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine and the faint smoke from the evening fire one of the other monks had built in the kitchen. From here, he could see for miles. The valley spread out beneath him, dark with forest, dotted here and there with the lights of distant villages. Above, the sky was deepening to indigo, and the first stars were appearing, faint and far. Jiro sat with his hands resting on his knees, his back as straight as his old bones would allow. He had sat like this 10,000 times before, in this exact spot, watching the day end and the night begin. It never grew old. Each evening was unique, the light different, the air different, his own state of mind different. He breathed slowly, feeling the cool air enter his nostrils, fill his lungs, then leave again, in and out. The most basic rhythm of life. Behind him, he could hear the soft sounds of the temple settling, the creak of wood, the rustle of wind in the eaves. These sounds were as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. This place had become part of him over the decades, or perhaps he had become part of it. The distinction no longer seemed important. He thought about his life, about all the years he had spent here. When he had first arrived, he had been full of questions, searching for answers, seeking enlightenment. He had practiced with fierce determination, sitting for hours until his legs screamed with pain, studying the sutras until his eyes burned. And gradually, over many years, something had changed. The urgency had faded. The questions had dissolved, not because he had found answers, but because he had realized that the questions themselves were the problem. There was nothing to achieve, nowhere to get to, no enlightenment waiting at the end of some long road. There was only this, the breath moving in and out, the stars emerging in the darkening sky, the cool air on his skin. This was enough. This had always been enough. A bird called from somewhere in the forest below, a single clear note that echoed across the valley. Jiro listened to it fade, then smiled slightly. Even that the fading of a sound was a kind of teaching. Everything arose and passed away. Nothing lasted. And in that impermanence was a strange kind of perfection. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see one of the younger monks, a man named Kenji, approaching with a cup of tea. Kenji was in his 30s, earnest and kind, still new to the rhythms of the temple. "I thought you might like some tea, master," Kenji said, bowing slightly. Jiro accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Sit with me," he said, gesturing to the porch beside him. Kenji sat, folding his legs beneath him, and they sat together in silence, watching the night deepen. After a while, Kenji spoke. "Master," he said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you maintain such peace? Even after all these years, you never seem disturbed by anything. I struggle so much with my practice. My mind is always restless, always jumping from thought to thought. How did you achieve this stillness?" Jiro was quiet for a long moment, sipping his tea. Then he said, "I didn't achieve anything. That's the secret, if there is one. I simply stopped trying to achieve." Kenji frowned slightly, not understanding. Jiro continued, his voice soft. "When you try to grasp stillness, you push it away. It's like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you grip, the more it escapes. But if you open your hand, the water rests there naturally." He held out his hand, palm up, as if demonstrating. "Don't try to still your mind. Just watch it. Watch the thoughts come and go, like clouds passing across the sky. You are not the thoughts. You are the sky." Kenji nodded slowly, considering this. They sat in silence again, and Jiro felt a deep affection for this young monk, for his sincerity, his earnest effort. He remembered being that age, full of questions and striving. It was a necessary stage, perhaps, but eventually one had to let go of the striving itself. The stars grew brighter as the night deepened. The valley below disappeared into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then fell silent. Jiro finished his tea and set the cup down beside him. He felt tired now, a deep bone weariness that came with age. His body was telling him it was time to rest. "Thank you for the tea," he said to Kenji. "I think I'll retire now." Kenji bowed. "Sleep well, master." Jiro stood slowly, his knees creaking, and made his way inside. His room was small and spare a sleeping mat, a single shelf holding a few books, a small altar with a candle and a statue of the Buddha. Nothing else. He changed into his sleeping robes and lay down on the mat, pulling a thin blanket over himself. The room was dark, lit only by the faint starlight coming through the window. He closed his eyes and felt his body settle into the mat. His breath slowed, becoming deep and even. His mind, usually so active during the day, grew quiet. He thought about Kenji's question, about peace and stillness. The truth was, he didn't feel peaceful all the time. He still experienced frustration, sadness, physical pain. These things had not gone away, but he had learned to let them be what they were. He didn't fight against them anymore. He didn't try to make them something else. And in that acceptance, there was a kind of peace. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of understanding. He felt himself beginning to drift towards sleep. His awareness grew soft and diffuse, spreading out beyond the boundaries of his body. He was the room, the temple, the mountain. He was the stars overhead and the earth beneath. And in that vast spaciousness, there was no separation between waking and sleeping, between self and world, between this breath and the next. He let go completely, surrendering to the pull of sleep. His last conscious thought was a feeling of gratitude for this day, for this life, for the privilege of having lived it as fully as he could. And then he was sleeping deeply and peacefully, his breathing barely audible, his face serene in the darkness. Outside, the night deepened. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the mountain held him as it held all things, with infinite patience and infinite care. And now, dear friend, as these stories come to rest, as the last words fade into silence, you too can let go. You have listened well. You have traveled with monks and dyers and beekeepers and shoemakers, with those who have learned the art of attending to small things with great care. And perhaps you have felt, in these quiet tales, something of what they discovered, that peace is not somewhere else, waiting to be found. It is here, in this moment, in this breath, in the simple act of being present with whatever is. Your body knows how to sleep. You don't have to work at it, don't have to make it happen. Just as the mountain knows how to hold the snow, as the river knows how to flow, your body knows how to rest. So let yourself be held by the bed beneath you, by the darkness around you, by the great silence that cradles all things. Let your breath slow, each exhalation longer than the last. Let your thoughts drift away like clouds at twilight, fading into the distance. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to do. This moment is complete just as it is. And as you drift deeper, as sleep comes to meet you like an old friend, know that you are safe, you are held, you are exactly where you need to be. The mountain rests, the river flows on, and you, dear friend, can sleep. Sleep deeply, sleep peacefully. Let the night carry you into dreams, or into the vast stillness beyond dreams. All is well, all is exactly as it should be. Sleep now.